Samako. Igama lami Vangile Gantsho, and this is I Expect More from You. Because my father fought for you. He gave himself to you. Instead of spending time with us, he lay on cement floors, behind bars, under beds, in wardrobes, behind dustbins for you. He forced my mother up and down from prisons to hospitals to prisons, baby on back, searching for him because of you. For you, my mother nursed, sold, worked hard when he couldn't work for us because he worked for you. So I expect more from you. Because my uncle left home post-matric for you. He left his leg in Lusaka for you. Became a child with a gun in foreign bushes for you. His parents worried for you. My mother was raided, covered up, worked thrice as hard for you. So I expect more from you, because Magazi lay on London benches for you. My aunt got kicked out of school, left home hidden in bakkies, was locked up in dark cells counting imaginary stars for you. She lost her love and buried her child in an unnamed grave for you. Even when you abandoned her across the oceans, she served you. Even when you tried to kill her, she gave herself to you in green and black, fist high, proud for you. So I expect more from you. I remember when we first saw your face. My mother sang for you. In long queues with ID books and scarf dinners, she signed for you, gave her voice to you, understood when Utata said it would take time. With her last cents, she supported you because you were the dream they had for us. So if for no other reason but for her, I expect more from you. More than you, who doesn't even remember her name, who doesn't even appreciate that she still signs for you years later, neck high in rent and taxi fare, unable to buy groceries. Even when you rub your theft in her face, she prays for you, gives to you, no longer expects from you. But I expect more from you, more than a limping uncle struggling to get your attention, poor veteran still holding on to dreams conjured up in Lusaka. Still believing all those years away from home will pay off someday. I expect more than umagazi ononyanyayo, because your taking never stops. Lifetimes later, struggling with hospital bills while you flaunt blue label luxuries in her face and pretend you don't remember her behind your high walls and tinted windows. I expect more from you, because as much as you gave to us, we gave to you always, with our lives and our limbs and our children. We gave for a dream you keep taking from us. With each cross you take, and all we get are broken promises, cheap t-shirts, or me on potbelly stages. We get raped by our fathers, our homes get broken into, and still your taking never stops. We have filled your stadia. We have sung your praises. We have devoted our lives to you. So damn it, I expect more from you.
Thank you to Vangile Gantsho. My name is Toki Mohoto. Welcome to the Basa Assembly, where we are Bularing the Sekele. Bula Sekele is the title of this session. We're trying to make the circle bigger. We're navigating access, inclusion, and diversity in the South African creative arts funding landscape. To this effect, we've invited panel members who are going to help us unpack what it is Bula Sekele and how do we as artists access funding. How do we navigate this dusty and sometimes precarious road? While we're trying to allow people to access funding equitably, we're also looking at qualitative programming and mutually beneficial partnerships, which we know can drive positive change and dent our socio-economic imbalances from the past. But how is that done? we are trying then with this platform to look at how then do we ensure that novices as well as established entities do cross-pollinate at some point. Artists, intermediaries, as well as enabling bodies from government are able to also chip in and add weight where it's necessary. Joining me as my panel members are Kelvin Ratladi, an interdisciplinary artist, Vuyisile Mshudulu, the Director of Art, Culture and Heritage in the city of Johannesburg, and lastly, Molemo Moila, an arts organizer as well as head of research for Andani Africa. Thank you so much for tuning into BASA Assembly. Wherever you are connecting from, we appreciate you and we hope you are going to enjoy this session. Help me welcome my panel members as we zoom into this conversation further. Vuyisile, thank you and welcome to the BASA Assembly. How do you do?
Greetings to everybody that has tuned in. Greetings to you, my brother, Mr. Mohoto. I'm doing well today. Thank you.
Great stuff. Kelvin Ratladi, welcome on board. How do you do today?
Hi, Toki. I am doing well, and how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. And Molemo Moila, last but not least, we're saving our best for last.
Hi, Toki. Good to see you. Hello, everybody. Great to be with you all.
Great stuff. How we're going to run the session is I'll give my panel members an opportunity to introduce themselves, make an opening statement, which I'll then also accompany with a question, which as they introduce themselves, they'll also answer the question. Starting with yourself, Vuyisile, give us a sense of who you are, what portfolio you occupy, and how the city of Joburg prioritizes budget and invest in the CCI sector so that they make sure that the sector of arts, culture, and heritage does grow, but most importantly, that the artist does benefit and create a healthy livelihood out of that.
Well, thank you. As you said, my name is Vuyisile Mshudulu, and I am from the city of Johannesburg, from the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Department, So basically what we do is that we've got three components to our offering, which focuses on the arts. We've got a number of programs that we do, some of the programs internally curated, and trying to stimulate the activity in the sector, in the sense that we identify talent and look at ways of cultivating it. But also once we have done that, we're also creating opportunities either for performance, for market access, and for other ways of monetizing the creative content that the creatives in the city have. We also focus on a component of us is on museums. We run the museum portfolio of the city. We've got a number of museums under our belt. Two of the main flagship ones, or actually there's more, that would include the Johannesburg Art Gallery, Museum Africa, and then we've got Soweto Museums, which include Hector Peterson, the Kliptown Museum, and also the June 16 Interpretation Center, amongst others, Then we also have a focus on heritage, mainly advising on adherence to heritage, looking at the protection and promotion of heritage and building a general appreciation from that perspective.
Great stuff. What a mouthful. I'm still going to zoom into some of the issues that you've mentioned, just so everyone watching, as well as any artist from Gauteng or wherever who wants to participate in your programs, know how to access it. Kelvin, let me come back to you. Thank you once again for joining us. Please also give us an opening statement into who you are, what it is that you do, and follow that with this question, which I'll ask now. What, in your view, has been a key feature of artists who've been lucky enough to enjoy unremitted access to funding?
Hi, my name is Calvin Ratladi. I'm a trained interdisciplinary artist. I freelance as a performer, producer, director, but holistically as a theater maker. I'm currently a part-time lecturer within the University of Pretoria, and I'm still involved in completing my master's degree. So, to answer your question, I think in answering it, we must just simply put it in simple terms. So what the question it actually asked is that what has been an important part that the artists who've been having constant access to funding and support, it more or less what role have they been playing? And the truth is, we can't answer this question without also looking into the current status quo within the arts sector. And for me, I think they're sitting in a position where they need to voice out. And I struggle actually to find an important or key feature that they're actually bringing, especially during this time, or also looking into a time of them having this benefits, being beneficiaries of the state subsidized arts institutions. Because also we need to really look into how South Africa specifically, in comparison to any country in the continent, is the most funded when it comes to the arts. But that state-funded fund actually supports only a few people. And in that actually, what it actually does, it makes them go mute, silent when they are needed, when they need to be speaking out. And what does that say about them as artists? Have they lost a sense of what art is? And perhaps that's what we need to be asking, if they are still reflecting fully on life while also really trying to remain into the human part of the art and the social role that the art actually needs to play.
Great stuff. Also, we're living in quite trying times for artists, emerging from COVID lockdown, and now having to self-sustain without having proper access to funding is quite a challenging one. I'm also reminding everyone who's watching to post their questions through our various platforms so that we field them and we allow our guests to answer as best as they can. I'm now moving on to Molemo. Molemo, once again, welcome to the platform. You will once again also introduce yourself and also answer just this short question. So often we hear how business has, through the CSI facility, assisted a couple of artists, right, within the CCI industry. How, in your view, does this statement bear merit, if any at all?
Thanks, Toki. To introduce myself, as has already been said, I'm Molemo. I am a practicing artist. I've been practicing under the moniker Made You Look as a collaborative for about 10, 11 years. But I've also worked for the last 10 years very much within the nonprofit sector, particularly working in nonprofit spaces aimed at developing access for people who are otherwise struggling to access the arts, whether it be through arts education for low-income peoples, or working most recently at Gantsho to enable access, particularly to things like funding, information, because the industry is the kind of industry where you need to know in order to access. And most recently have moved into the more sort of commercial side, starting a new business, which has been quite a roller coaster ride of learning with my colleague Lonwabo Mavusa Zandani Africa. And we are a research entity really trying to develop knowledge around the creative industries, understanding the creative industries better. Your question's an important one. And I think, the first thing to talk about in terms of corporate social investment in the arts is that often when we see corporate investment in the arts, it's not necessarily CSI, corporate social investment being this percentage of a profit that should go to the greater good in society. And as Calvin has pointed to, there are different ways in which funding can support the arts, and corporate social investment is aimed towards greater good. Usually when corporates are funding the arts, it's actually coming from marketing budgets, not from corporate social investment budgets. And those marketing budgets are oriented towards big, visible arts. It's not necessarily aimed towards the smaller artists, the artists are really doing great work in their communities, etc. And so while there is quite a lot of flow of corporates into the sector, it's not necessarily so much at that developmental level, and certainly not so much at the individual artist level, unless, of course, you can fill up the dome or something like this. And so I think while corporate social investment definitely has an important role to play, and even the marketing budgets of corporates have a big role to play, as Calvin, I think, has so rightfully pointed to, and Vuyisile has to some degree as well, there are many elements to the art sector, and it's a complex funding dynamic, I think.
Definitely. We're looking at a sector which has at least plus minus 16 disciplines, and there's oftentimes a disjointed, or rather a mismanaged prioritization of sometimes the performance arts space, right? And one wonders, though, if we are saying these are the challenges that we see within the creative arts sector, what is the role and responsibility of creatives in one, ensuring that there is a degree of self-sustainability to cut the dependency syndrome, right? On the other, view themselves as businesses, so that whoever invests in you doesn't just see you as someone who has capabilities of filling the dome, as it were, but you can self-sustain beyond that seed funding. Can maybe some of our panel members share in that short question I've asked?
Okay. I also would like to just share my views, on today's subject, because all I did in the beginning was just to give an introduction,
Please,
my sense is that, and I want to start with the framing of today's subject, which is navigating access, inclusion, and diversity. Because my sense is that framing is in many ways misleading, and it can be deceptive, but also it is problematic in the sense that it does not deal with the root cause, of how is it that, the creative sector finds itself dependent or in need of funding intervention. And when you talk about inclusion, who must include who, because who is excluded, and what is the genesis of that exclusion, And my central thesis in addressing this, I think we have to understand, the nature of and structure of our general economy, and the nature and structure of the economy therefore impacts the creative industries, because the creative industries is a microcosmic reflection of what is happening in the general structure. And the general structure is that at the root cause level, we must talk about what is it that happened historically, to create the levels of desperation, dependency, and even deprivation, in the creative industries. And we can't disconnect that from the history of invasion and land dispossession, which is the coloniality of violence that permeates so many other areas of human endeavor, including the creative industries. So for me, we have to begin the conversation at that level, so that we understand that when we talk about inclusion, access, and diversity, these are manifestation of a much deeper problem, and therefore we don't deal with these notions at a soporific level, And for me, that if we frame the discourse in this way, the impression it gives is that the problem is lack of access, or the problem is exclusion, that affects South Africans. But in equal measure, the truth is that, Black people in particular, and in particular Black women, are the most marginalized and exploited in any sector of the economy, and that what is happening in the creative industry, it's not an isolated reflection, So for me, therefore, we have to look at these things in that way. So in my view, in essence, the problems facing Black creatives is not so much exclusion or lack of access, not even the lack of diversity. Black creatives are in a position of powerlessness, and as a consequence of the historic and contemporary positionality of Black people in general, And until we understand the character of that positionality, which has its genesis in the history of coloniality and even coloniality as manifest in contemporary terms, we will not be able to deal with the challenges facing the creatives more holistically and more comprehensively, So the lived experience of the Black artist in particular is a reflection of the anti-Black character of coloniality, their historical experiences, and also what they continue to enjoy in contemporary terms, So how do we then, understanding the root cause, then try and understand how is it that we can now understand why is it that so many people find themselves in the periphery and unable to access the mainstream. We must understand, the character of colonial violence. Firstly, the character of colonial violence is racialized. It takes on a very racialized component. And secondly, that it is very patriarchal. But thirdly, it is economic, And through all of those segments, there is a great deal of exclusion that happens, from a racial perspective, from a patriarchal perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because the racialized component is largely anti-Black. The patriarchal is male-dominated, in particular white, male-dominated, and you see the ownership of the economy is as such, So when we talk about access, we must not talk about access in a superficial way, Access must be more comprehensive, and it must talk to issues of ownership rather than just participation. But also those in privilege, what gives us the comfort that those in privilege will be willing to facilitate the access, particularly towards the ownership of the means of productions for those that we perceive to be excluded, if we even want to accept that as a correct thesis, because cultural imperialism, for example, facilitates access for cultural content that seeks to entrench coloniality through the maintenance of a Euro-American hegemony. And from that perspective, I think that we must be careful in how we diagnose the problem so that we don't end up coming with a prognosis which is flawed, because the creatives, particularly the Black creatives in this country, are not facing a crisis of exclusion, they are facing a crisis of dispossession, and yeah.
Might I just pause you a bit there? I want to quickly jump to Molemo. Molemo, Vuyisile has said quite a mouthful. I just want to zoom into what you do as a research platform, right? How important to you is data integrity and factual reporting in one preventing geographic discrimination? What do I mean by that? To say, if people are largely in Gauteng and funding institutions mostly support them, as opposed to someone who's in the Northern Cape, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, right? How does data integrity as well as factual reporting help us avert that misnomer? That's one. Secondary to that, how then are we able to ensure that whatever funding opportunities exist are spread out throughout the country and becomes a true reflection of our demographic makeup?
Thanks, Toki. I mean, I think that question really relates very closely to what Vuyisile has just been saying around the fact that so many of the challenges of enabling access to funding are so complex and deeply historical. And so a question like yours around, for example, provincial distribution of funding is very much related to what Vuyisile is saying. There's incredible inequality around infrastructure support in relation to bigger cities and to rural areas. I think it's important to recognize that this issue is an international issue. So even in European countries, they struggle to enable more funding to artists in rural areas, for example. So this isn't just a problem that we have, but I think our problem is exacerbated by exactly the kinds of things Vuyisile has mentioned. And one of the problems that emerges from some of those limitations and that kind of historical total abandonment of rural areas, and particularly Black people in rural areas, has been the lack of information. We don't actually have a full sense of how creative sectors operate in rural areas. When we do develop research and understanding of these areas, that research isn't maintained, it isn't consistent. And so if a lot of the funders are based in the cities and they are much more familiar with how city arts industries work, they're going to respond to that because there just isn't a knowledge of how the kinds of flows and networks of the creative sector in rural areas works. And so data becomes really important in that way because you can use data to really make a good argument and to really push for more strategic sort of solutions. And I think that part of what Vuyisile is pointing to of this very deep complexity of the issues that we're facing requires complex solutions because they are complex problems, they require complex solutions. And I think this is one of the biggest difficulties we have because we don't have a lot of the information, but also somehow we tend to really focus on our urgencies, and COVID-19 has really created even more of a sense of this. In that kind of focus on urgency, we're unable to respond to the full breadth of that complexity, including some of these historical issues that Vuyisile has pointed to.
Great stuff. Kelvin, as a practicing interdisciplinary artist, I obviously cannot leave this matter out. We've recently seen how sometimes perceived or existing maladministration may end up causing the sector to regress, as it is currently the case with the NAC. In your own experience, what do you feel could be done differently going forward?
I think for me, it's very simple. It's really going back to understanding the mandate and the integrity and everything that these institutions have put out and really ensuring that quarterly those things are met. We can't wait for a year for an institutions that the only thing that actually happens is that they are only reporting back. And when they report back, their reports are beautiful. I always say, personally, I know I'm always interested in reading reports of different institutions. And the truth is, everything that they're saying, they meet policy statements. But the truth is, if we're to really go down into auditing on who gets what, that's what the problem is. But the truth is, the number of people that were supposed to be given what actually did get that. And that's where the problem lies. We only go back to reading the last reports and not looking back down into who gets what, who gets what, who gets prioritized when this comes, and on what basis. Like the three elements that Vuyisile has spoken about. And I guess also it's one of those things that we need to look back and say, the people who are at the leadership of these institutions, have they embodied those three elements which are very problematic and very complex? And the question is, have now they embodied those elements to an extent that no longer they are speaking back to what actually they are mandated to do in these institutions that they are running?
Let me come back to you, Vuyisile. You spoke quite a mouthful. One may argue to say Blacks are in the majority in SA and should be commanding the sector. Even if funding is lagging here and there, but they should be creating means and ways of self-sustaining. How did your city respond to creatives who essentially were frontline workers during COVID lockdown? And how are you managing the situation post-lockdown as realities?
Okay, I want to start responding to your question in this way. You know, the effectiveness or non-effectiveness of state institutions in South Africa must be understood in the context of South Africa as a polity came into being as a result of an act that was passed in a British Parliament in 1909. We have to understand what was the intention of establishing this polity and what was the intended purpose that it was set out to serve, you know. And the purpose it was set out to serve was to serve a colonial agenda. Now, the question we must ask, have we redirected or reorientated or changed the focus of this polity called South Africa so that it begins to reflect the aspirations of the citizens of this country, in particular the natives of this country, you know? And I think if we approach the question of the effectiveness, whether it is of the National Arts Council or the City of Johannesburg, with that background in mind, we will begin to have an appreciation why it is that we may perceive these institutions to be non-effective, because I don't think we have dealt with the structural flaws of the polity and how it is constituted, you know. But to answer your question at a micro level, as the city, you know, we took a different approach to many state institutions in terms of how we approach the relief issue, you know, because we did not want the relief to be a SASSA type of arrangement, you know. So we understood that creatives essentially carry with them intrinsic value, and that value is deeply rooted in their dignity, you know. And we said, for you to be able to earn something that will create relief, you also have to provide the value that you are naturally endowed with. So we created a number of programs. We stretched, for example, the Arts Alive program from September up to the end of December, and it created opportunity for thousands of artists. But what was beautiful about that is that it did not just create financial relief, but it also looked at creating emotional and psychological relief, because artists were able to get on stage to perform, even if it was to a virtual audience. So it also dealt with the traumatic issues that they experienced during the lockdown. And at the same time, we were able to pay them, you know, decent performance fees or even other fees for their contribution. And it becomes a more dignified arrangement. And it is for that reason that we as a city don't find ourselves embroiled in, we should have given who so much and we have not, you know, because all the artists that have provided those services to the city were paid, and they were paid on time. Thank you.
Great stuff. Let me just take a few comments from our online participants. There's a question that was fielded by Chester Martinez. The question is, what platforms are geared to support a startup within the creative industries rather? Any of my panel members can just note that down and answer it when I give an opportunity. Sompi Simpemba comments to say, before we go to funding, should we not look at the role of the creative industry in perpetuating racism, patriarchy, and capitalist exploitation, right? And then it goes on to ask a question in the end to say, what about the rest of Black people who have been economically decimated before and post-COVID, right? And then there's a compliment coming from Sibusiso Mulefe, who says, I share Mr. Mshudulu's sentiments as far as ownership being the solution. But his question though is, how do we transfer knowledge to say a rural Black entrepreneur can also access similar opportunities as opposed to someone who lives in a city when transformation doesn't exist in the CCI sector? Maybe Molemo, let's start with you there, and then we'll go to the other participants.
You know, I'd like to maybe bring Vangile's incredible poem into our conversation a bit, and really recognize the power of what she was saying. It really gave me goosebumps. And she had this statement of, I expect more from you. And I think that's an important point, particularly in relation to some Sibusiso's comments of what really are our expectations, what are our visions for this art sector. And to be honest, for me, the idea that NAC gives you a small grant, that is the lowest expectation. I think our expectations need to go beyond that. And an example of this, for example, is that our research shows that the national lotteries, for example, has historically had 3 times almost the budget of the National Arts Council. And yet here we are demanding from the National Arts Council, but there hasn't really been a conversation about the National Lotteries funding for the arts. What has happened with that funds? What has been the response at the period of COVID? How are we demanding from those who are able to pull the levers of funding that the way that our funding is distributed is coordinated, is strategic, has longer term plans, is looking to address some of these issues? And there are certain examples. I think, for example, the National Film and Video Foundation is one that's quite strong in this arena. But some of what Kelvin was pointing to of the fact that artists are operating at very different levels. Not all of us are going to be business people. Some people are working very much at the level of community. How are all these different arts funders, whether it be the Department of Arts and Culture, Sports Arts and Culture nationally, provincial, city, where is the coordination to ensure that we're not all funding the same people, that we're not funding the same people forever and there isn't a long-term plan? And I think that sometimes, as I say, in the face of urgency, we can start to look at the crumbs. And we really need to be thinking quite a lot bigger about how we as a sector make more strategic, futuristic kind of demands on the way that funding operates in our sector.
Great stuff. Kelvin, to what degree do you feel that artists do cross-pollinate? My question is to ask, if you do exchange ideas and you explore and exploit synergy, and also assist novices to make sure that there's equity as well as a real transfer of knowledge and skills share?
For me, to answer that question, I think one of the things that we really don't look into is the kind of research that the institutions is providing and archiving in the institutions not to actually use. And which is something that perhaps we need to start going back and say, if someone writes a whole paper that's more than 100 pages, 200 pages, what is there? There's no way that we can't find a sentence that gives us something. And there's a lot. And in that, at the same time, I'm not excluding the people who are already practically doing that. They're practically doing that without relying on any state funding. And in that, for me also, I feel that the dependency syndrome is something that an artist generally shouldn't have. Because for me, what it does, it actually hinders you. And I'll make a simple example with myself. I haven't got any state funding in the past 4 years. I was actually calculating recently, and I've still practiced as an artist. And it was a choice. It was a choice of being, I've always been rejected and I was tired. And from that moment I stopped. It's that moment when my career just went up. And for me, it's interesting that I think if I were to get funding today, I would know what I would do. I would know what I would do. I would know how I would make sure that that small funding actually creates another project for another person, not necessarily for me. And I think it's those things that we need to look into as artists, that as much as we go for this funding, what is it that we intend to do that goes beyond? If, for instance, Calvin is excluded, how do I reach out later to Calvin and then say, what can you give out of this? And for me, I think those are the things. Surely there's gonna be a lot of reasons where artists, we can say that, okay, I applied for this much and I didn't get all of it. I got maybe 40% of it. And then that becomes another issue. But when you get all of it, chances are you were already also overestimating and hoping that you get at least to 80%. And so for me, it's about how do we create a model, a framework that brings us all, brings people who are around you to this idea of mentorship. And for me, it's possible. It's possible with the people who are really getting it all.
Here's a question from the social media platform, which is also borrowing from what we've been discussing largely. What new funding models are we needing to create? If we essentially saying now, we can't all rely on the NAC, we can't all look to DSEC to say, make us alive as artists, right? What funding models are we now supposed to create to make sure that the challenges we now see do not perpetuate themselves into the future?
Okay, I can take that question, but before I answer it, I just want to emphasize what my brother Kelvin was saying by quoting from the late great artist Ntate David Kolwane, who said, "I am an artist because I'm an artist, not because I'm funded to be one." You know, and I think you know, we have to redefine the role of the arts, and I'm not talking the creative industries, but the arts, you know, in society, particularly in relation to the question of funding from that perspective. But to answer your question about funding models, you know, the first thing is that we have to resolve the problem, the structural problems with the funding models for the country, you know, the way in which that the country is managing its estate and how that estate becomes monetized to create value that can be distributed, you know, to create a good quality of life for all its citizens. There's a problem at that stage already, and there's a fundamental problem in how that is structured. And central to that is the question of ownership, juxtaposed with dispossession, and we need to resolve that question. So then if you cascade down, obviously those structural problems also find their way into how funding models are structured in the creative industries in various institutions of the state, but also it also informs the attitude of the private sector in terms of how it invests in the creative industries. And that attitude is one that seeks to perpetuate coloniality instead of finding ways to decolonize, you know, our spaces and our mental, physical, and spiritual spaces. So that's one of the things that we have to redefine, more than just looking at the administrative and practical elements of how these funding models are structured, because I think that for me is a very simple thing to do. What we have to do, we have to go to the structure, the heart of these funding models, and how these are enabling, you know, changing power relations in society, where Black artists can become owners of the means of production rather than those that are perpetual performers, you know, to the amusement of those that own the means of production. And we really need to change that paradigm for me. And I think we have the technical abilities, all of us, to change the administrative ways in which funding models are administered. But I don't think the problem lies there. The problem lies in the structure that the country itself does not manage its estate properly. You know, everything within our geographic space. And that goes to the heart of sovereignty. You know, are we really a sovereign state if we say we have so much wealth in the country, but that wealth cannot be used to the advancement of the citizens? So that is the funding model that we need to resolve. Thank
you. Any additions, Molemo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from a practitioner point of view, like Calvin, I've gotten to the point where I don't want to be writing proposals and begging for small bits of money and really struggling through particularly the inability to be able to prepare in advance and to be able to plan long-term and grow long-term, that the kind of funding situation we have in South Africa creates. And so I have really moved towards trying to think in very different forms around financing. So part of the reason I left VANSA is I recognized VANSA in its very structure will always be dependent on funding, and will always be asking for funding from the same funders that the members that it's trying to support are asking for funding from, you know. And it's structurally a problem that the non-profit structure is really, really difficult to maintain in this country. And it's built off a model that comes from the global north, where money functions very differently. My own artistic practice for the past 10 years with my collaborator, we've always worked 9 to 5s and then use that funding towards our artistic practice. Now, this may not be the perfect solution for everyone, but I do think that we need to start to look at multifaceted ways of operating. And we need to be looking at models that are not based on structures from other places that don't actually work for our context. As Calvin's mentioned, we have more funding than anybody else on the continent. And yet, there are many people on the continent with no state funding for the arts whatsoever who are able to practice. What are the models they're using? Should we not be looking at the continent instead of, for example, Europe, for how we really want to be managing our art systems, and then increasing those, making those better because there is funding for the arts here. And for me, that's about starting a new business. And maybe to respond to one of the questions, there's very little support for an art startup. I mean, the process of becoming an entrepreneur has been incredibly difficult. The hurdles are very challenging. What you need to learn is very different from, say, a nonprofit that I've run for a long time. But we need to be moving into these spaces, testing different strategies and combining different strategies, rather than trying to rely on systems that we've inherited, I think.
Great stuff. Another question from us with the platform. Do you agree that cross-sector funding is critical to the sustainability of the arts and should extend beyond ticking a CSI box? Anyone for the taking?
I could maybe come in here because I think one of the things that has been quite fascinating in some of the research we've been doing recently is thinking about the idea of creative economy instead of creative industries. And how some people define this idea is the fact that there's the need for creative practice throughout the economy. It's not simply ourselves within the, I think Toki mentioned a certain number of disciplines, the kind of UNESCO defined disciplines. But in fact, creativity is deeply needed in engineering, is deeply needed in technology, and many of the kinds of critical thinking, political thinking, some of the things that Vuyisile has brought to the fore, the creatives are often operating in, are very desperately needed in other sectors. Do we understand the way we can sell our capacities and skills, or articulate the value of our capacities and skills in other parts of the broader economy? And one of the areas that has become really interesting for us as Andani Africa, for example, has been some of the conversations about where technology is going in the future and how technology is changing. And that internationally it's identified, for example, that in the fourth industrial revolution, creativity is one of the most important top 5 skills that will be needed. How are we thinking about the ways in which we move into these spaces, rather than always limiting ourselves to these small spaces, these small pots of funding, these small kind of universes of practice? How do we expand ourselves beyond those?
Maybe a short question though is, how do we define the sector? Some call it the creative economy, some call it the cultural and creative industry. Some may just say it's just creative arts. Doesn't that in itself also lay a question to say, hence it is not viewed as a critical collaborator in our GDP, right? And also as something that can generate income and healthy livelihoods for practitioners in the sector. Isn't that a problem perhaps that business sit down and think, if we are funding these people, what value are we gaining in return as a result? Well,
for me, the arts has to perform a function which is bigger than just economics, because in the African cosmology, the purpose of art, is multifaceted. It is spiritual, it is emotional, it is environmental, it is part of our lived experience. It shapes our thinking, it shapes so much of what we do, and a lot of what is classified as art in the African cosmology is actually not art, it is spirituality, and we have to create those distinctions. But there is scope for the monetization, of our creative output, but it must not be to the detriment of the essence for which, the natural and intrinsic intuition to create stands for, because in the African cosmology, that natural intuition and intrinsic intuition to create value, whether it takes an artistic form, should not be conflated with something that is a commodity, because it got a much deeper value. And I think we need to understand art in that frame, or creative output in the African cosmology in that frame, and understand that although there is scope for monetization, creating industry or say creative sectors out of that, it shouldn't be our driving force, because that is where we get lost in translation.
Just a short question. When you look at the merging of the departments of sport, of both sports and arts and culture, aren't there models that we can adopt from the sports fraternity to say if so much investment goes into it, so too can the same investment be driven to the arts sector? Molemo, Kelvin, hello.
I mean, I can weigh in. I mean, I think what Vuyisile was saying just now about the fact that arts comes from a very different kind of culture is an important one.
Yes,
and so I think there are some things that we might be able to learn from sports, but you know, sports also has a problem of big football players who do really, really well, make a lot of money, struggling when they get older and not necessarily being able to kind of extend their success at a younger age into an older age, etc. And I think that we, in some ways, we have a little bit more to offer. And my interest in, for example, to give an example of something what Vuyisile was just saying, we recently ran a program from some of the research that we were doing looking at artificial intelligence. And there is a South African based at Harvard, Sabelo Mhlambi, who's thinking about using Ubuntu as a basis for completely rethinking AI, because it's having these problems of racism, of sexism internationally in the US, and that if you could sort of have a grounding foundation of artificial intelligence in Ubuntu, you could shift this. And he's doing this research at Harvard, and he was speaking very much to how creativity and the arts from the African continent has a role to play in reimagining these kinds of futures. So I think, for me, I wouldn't be looking to sport. I would be looking to other kinds of industries that are moving into a completely different way of thinking and recognizing the role that we have to play there, as I say, rather than limiting ourselves to these much smaller worlds and to this kind of very limited economic conversation around sponsorship or funding, but rather recognizing where we belong in the world and what we have to offer to the world.
Great stuff. May I invite my panelists to share closing remarks before we officially wrap up the session?
Okay, I thought Kelvin would go first.
Okay, yeah. Okay, firstly, it will be very irresponsible for me not to acknowledge the artists who are really making their voices heard, who are out there sleeping at the NAC for 23 days now without really getting adequate attention, which is immediate, as it's supposed to be. I would like to send a shout out and a message of support to say, we are all in this, we are here together. And in closing, there's someone who's saying something interesting about disagreeing with me about a choice of being excluded. And yes, I do agree, I was excluded, but I was invited for many times by many institutions after I've been excluded, because they saw a success of my career when I was not depending on them. And then I refused because they saw that as a policy report, and I refused to be part of a policy report and document. And then that's where I said, no, I am doing well right now. I'm not coming back now until I know when I come back, I'm not being brought back for a policy document. And hence I'm very choosy when I work with government institutions or do anything within the government, because I'm always seen as just another person who has to fill out a policy document. So in closing, I'd like to just thank BASA for this platform and inviting me to share my thoughts.
Great stuff. Vuyisile, and then we move to Molemo.
Okay, in my closing, I just want to say, you know, my principle in life is that for you to have an effective prognosis to any problem, your diagnosis must be accurate, you know, and our accurate diagnosis is that the problems that are facing the creative industries are the problems that are facing the lived experience, in particular of Black people in general, and those lived experiences stem from, the coloniality of invasion and dispossession, and how that manifests into every aspect of our human endeavor, including the creative industries and all the aspirations that the practitioners and participants in the creative industries may have, But also, I think we also must, because part of the purpose of the arts is to reflect honestly on the reality in society. And artists must reflect on the reality. The reality is that we are not living in a free society. We are living in a society that is under the illusion of freedom, because democracy is not freedom, And I think we need to see more, artistic reflection on that reality, because it will bring us closer to understanding the daily problems that we have to grapple with, But in closing, I also like to thank BASA for the opportunity of being invited to share our humble thoughts in this platform, but also to indicate that artists have to find ways of re-understanding and reorientating them on their challenges, and always having a deeper appreciation for history, so that we can have a much more better appreciation for the vision of our life going forward. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you. Molemo, just briefly from your end as well.
Thanks, Toki. Very briefly, I mean, I think that Vuyisile has really brought a lot of the challenges of our historical legacy. Calvin, in bringing the current protests of the National Arts Council into our conversation, brings up these very difficult challenges of this current moment. And I would just call on the fact that I think if anybody can bring that past, the contemporary urgency and a future way of thinking into a broader thinking, it's going to be artists. And we need to keep our eyes open and on the horizon to deal with all three layers of past, current, and the future.
Great stuff. Thank you so much to my great panelists, Molemo, Moila, Vuyisile Mshudulu, as well as Kelvin Ratladi, and to BASA for creating this platform where we were having a robust engagement looking at the idea of inclusion, equitable access to funding, as well as navigating this precarious road, which is the artistic landscape of South Africa. Thank you so much to everyone who was watching us from our different social media platforms. Please continue looking forward to many more platforms like this through the BASA website. It's www.basa.co.za. And we are out.